Welcome to Journey to Justice. I'm Eiko Kosasa, and today I interview Julia Estrella, a longtime community activist about civil disobedience. A retired social worker, Julia has worked and continues to work in solidarity with many communities, from Native Hawaiians to Micronesians to Christian churches. I started the interview by asking Julia about her background, where she was born and raised.
Okay, I was born in Pineapple Country in the middle of Wahiawa, and my mother was a picture bride from Nakagusuko, Kita Nakagusuko, Okinawa, and my father was from Hiroshima, and they both worked on the sugar plantation for most of their lives.
Oh, so then you grew up on the plantation?
They didn't get married until they moved to Wahiawa.
Oh, okay.
So they were working the sugar plantation, and then Wahiawa was Pineapple Town.
Oh, okay.
And my father got promoted. He became the janitor of the Wahiawa Elementary School.
Oh.
So that was a promotion.
Oh.
Away from the sugarcane field.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So can you talk a little about how you came to political consciousness?
I guess I'll start. One clear memory that I have is that when I graduated from kindergarten, I was put to a test because in those days, in 1945, there used to be what we called an English standard track inside public school. And the purpose of the English standard track was so that people who spoke good English, mostly the Caucasians, would not be put to test with our pidgin English. And since Japanese was my first language, I didn't speak English that well until I went to kindergarten.
Okay.
And so in the English standard test, the teacher would take us one by one and would show us a picture on the wall and say, tell us about this, and tell us about this. And being from a immigrant family and being taught to be quiet most of the time and not to be shaberu or talk, talk, talk. I would say cat, dog, house, mouse, giraffe, and that's not what they were looking for. They were looking for your ability to talk in English. And so of course I failed the test. And somehow I knew that there was something unjust about this test, because somehow I knew that the people who passed the test would be in the public school, but in a better track. You know, the ones for the elites, the ones who would get the better teachers, the better equipment, the better excursions. So I was so upset that I failed the test, even at that age.
5 years old?
Yes.
Wow.
And so I told my dad, who doesn't speak English, was a janitor at the school, please go and talk to the principal and plead with him to let his daughter into the English standard track.
My goodness.
So my poor father, I mean, his daughter had a temper tantrum. And so he marched himself to the principal's office. I wish I was a fly on the wall. But he couldn't speak much English, just broken English. And so when he came out, of course, he was not successful in persuading the principal that I belonged in the English standard track of the public school system. So, but at least I was proud of him. And I think that maybe part of my activism came from the fact that even though I pushed him to it, he was willing to make a stand for his daughter, even though he failed.
And that time for a janitor to go Japanese, and probably the principal was holy, right?
Yeah.
To go into
yes.
the office and say that you're
right.
his
I
daughter.
didn't remember his name. I think his name was Leroy. Leroy. But anyway, it was good to see that my father was willing to do something, you know, to take a stand
so
for his daughter.
I guess you were sort of politically conscious then from age 5, but it must have had to do with your family.
No, it wasn't political consciousness so much as it just felt wrong. You know, it just felt like, hey, I'm smart. You know, why are they tracking us in the first place? And why, you know, why not put us all, mix us up, instead of saying, okay, you're smarter because you speak better English. And invariably, they were mostly Caucasian children.
Yeah.
And so that offended me somehow.
Rightly so.
And so I think that was sort of the framework from which my sense of injustice, or fairness, I would say fairness, even at age 5, you know what's fair. I think most kids know,
Yeah.
you know, what's fair and what's not fair. And I guess that was when my consciousness of what's fair really became very highlighted for me and framed the rest of my high school and elementary years.
Wow. So then do you have a point where you feel like you became politically conscious? Like you were saying that was more like just
Yes.
about justice. Yeah.
Well, I think through my reading of Malcolm X's autobiography and Queen Liliuokalani's The Queen Story. Now, when I went to University of Hawaii, Manoa, there was no such thing as Third World Studies. And so we didn't know our history. We were never taught our own history. I didn't read The Queen Story or Malcolm X until way beyond when I was post-college. And when I went to UC Berkeley to get my master's in social work, that's when I became more politically conscious. Because the second year of my social work, I had to spend at a field placement. And we had to find our own field placement. And so I called up a Chinese woman who had just gotten elected to be the first Chinese American or the first Asian American city councilwoman in Berkeley. And I didn't know her. I just read that she won the election. And she was considered part of the Progressive Coalition. So I called her up and I introduced myself and I said, I'm a graduate student in social work. I have to put in a whole year of field work. Can I work for you as a volunteer? And she didn't know who I was. All she knew was my name and that I was an Asian. And she was looking for an Asian American to work in her office. So immediately she said, oh, I would love to have you come and work for me and I'll pay you. I wasn't looking for a paid placement, but she was willing to pay me as her administrative assistant.
What year was this?
This was 1974.
Oh, okay.
And so my political consciousness was accelerated because she was a progressive. And she took me to all the rallies. And the one rally I remember very clearly was the one in front of University Hall, where a group of activists were going to block the entrance to the University Hall and possibly do civil disobedience. I call it civil obedience because there's a higher law, more than the civil law. So anyway, she took me to this meeting where we were fighting for divestment in terms of the pension fund, any divestment from South Africa. And so we were just standing there and we were enjoying the demonstration, and we had no intention of doing civil disobedience. And when all of a sudden they said, okay, everybody who's willing to get arrested, please sit in front of the door. And my boss, Ying Lee is her name, Ying Lee Kelly. And she used to be a school teacher before she got elected. And she said, Julia, she looked around and she said, Julia, you and I are the only Asian Americans in this room, outside.
Yeah.
We have to get arrested because it looks bad. The rest of the people are whites and blacks, and there's no Asian Americans except you and me. So she said, we got to get arrested. So she pushed me down in front of the door, sat down next to me, and so that was my first unexpected arrest.
Yeah.
But that arrest turned out, because there were so many of us, maybe 50 of us, when you have that many numbers, you have people power. And so they don't have room for you in the prison or in the holding cells. So what they did was immediately on the spot, they fingerprinted us and basically, gave us a piece of paper that says, you're going to show up in court on this day. And then 2 weeks later, what happens is I get a letter saying that the charges have all been dropped. So that was not what I expected. I thought we would have to go to court.
Some trial or
some trial. There was no trial, but there were 50 of us, I think. So I think there was just too much clogging the courts.
Yes.
So that was my first experience.
But what did you feel about being arrested?
Well, because there were so many of us, it didn't feel threatening at all. I mean, when you're with 50 people all doing the same thing, you're pretty confident that there's enough of you to make a difference. Now, my second arrest was in in the early 1990s, I believe. I think it was 1993, when I was visiting on the island of Kauai. I still lived in California at that time. But around the early 1993, the Kanaka Maoli had formed a coalition with environmentalists to mobilize against the so-called Star Wars missile launch from the Pacific Missile Range facility in Barking Sands, Kauai.
Yeah.
And for the environmentalists, it was the poisoning of the land. For the Kanaka Maoli, this was their sacred land, where it would be a burial site for their ancestors, sort of a leaping off point. And so the coalition took place. And I was invited to participate in the second mobilization with the intention of getting arrested. And this was scary because this is military land.
Yeah.
And you know, you hear about military arrest that you end up really in prison for 6 months to a year.
Right.
So this was
What
kind
made
of...
you decide that you should do this?
I think because this was supposed to be a church delegation, and they wanted as many church people to get arrested with the Kanaka Maoli. And so Kaleo Patterson, Reverend Kaleo Patterson, tried to get as many of us who were active church people in the United Church of Christ and other churches, Methodists and so on. And because I knew Kaleo, and I respected his leadership, and I knew some of the people who were also going to be arrested, I said, okay, well, you know, I thought it would be as easy as the first time. You know, once you do it, you know, you think, well, you know, nothing happened. 2 weeks later, everything was dropped.
Right.
There's not even a record that I was arrested. So I thought, okay, well, this is military land. It's more dangerous, maybe, you know, in one's thinking. But I decided, since my friends were doing it from the church, that I would join them. So we went to the gate of the PMRF, Pacific Missile Range facility, and Kaleo and some of the other church pastors started negotiating and said, let us get on the land so we can do a prayer vigil for our ancestors. This is just a worship service we want to hold on the land, so please let us in. And the funny thing about this fence was, I don't know why they constructed it, it was just a facade of a fence. On both sides, you can go in.
Around the side?
Yes, open. It's just a gate, a facade of a gate.
Fence.
And so here we are at the gate, the facade of a gate, and Kaleo and other pastors are negotiating, and took
So
about...
the military's on this, that's who they're talking
Yes,
to,
and
the
and here it's open both sides, but we're talking through the gate because we're not allowed to, you know, come in. So what happened is we had a cue from Kaleo that when he felt the negotiations was over with, I mean, there was no sense arguing with them. They're not going to give in. Our cue was he would say, "Okay, let's go," and that was, you know, the sides are open.
Right.
That means we just cross over into
Right.
the military land.
Right.
And so that was our cue. So there were about 12 of us, I think.
Okay.
And this time we didn't have people power. We just marched into the sides, and some of the Kanaka Maoli wanted to make a statement, so they climbed the facade of a gate. They climbed the fence. And the rest of us who were not climbers, you know, we walked in from the side. And immediately as we walked in, these soldiers wearing fatigues, you know, you couldn't see them because they were hiding behind the bushes. All of a sudden they appeared, and they started to grab each one of us. And they were so much harder on the Kanaka Maoli. They were really rough with the Kanaka Maoli.
Wow.
I mean, and they had those plastic, I call them plastic handcuffs.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they would make them really tight on the Kanaka Maoli people.
Oh, interesting.
You know, make them hurt. And I thought it was, again, I mean, there was a clear distinction between us, you know, who were Asian Americans, and the Kanaka Maoli, they were really, really rough with.
So
I
they
thought,
know whose land it is.
yes,
Yeah.
they know whose land, whose pet,
Yeah.
that they were the leaders and we were the followers.
Yeah.
And so, and after we were all handcuffed, they put us on a military bus, and they said, okay, we're going to ask each one of you to come down one by one so we can question you. But even though I was not part of the training, everybody else had been trained to say in one loud voice, no, we are not In other words, just stand together. Always the response is a together answer. So the whole busload of people said no. I think there were 12 or 13 of us. Said no, we're not going to come down one by one. In other words, they're going to have to drag us out, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, the military officer, they're not used to having disobedience.
Yeah.
You're supposed to obey.
Yeah.
And they're not used to having anyone obey, especially those who they just arrested.
Yeah.
So they were just so discombobulated to hear a loud no from the whole group that he walked away from the bus and went to his superior and said, you know, this busload of people, they're refusing to come out one by one.
Yeah.
So what shall we do? Well, a few minutes later, the young man comes in. He says, well, we're going to turn you over to the civil authorities. When we were arrested, we had no ID. We knew that we should not have any ID.
So no one had any
No
ID?
one had any ID on us. So when we got to Lihue, the civil authorities happened to be young, what looked to us like young Japanese Americans. And they looked like new officers. And because when we sat in front of them to answer questions, they would ask us questions like, what is your name? And we had all agreed to be Jane Doe and John Doe. So we all had the same name. If we were male, we were John Doe or Jane Doe. So my name was Jane Doe. Then they would say, how many pounds are you? And I'd say, I think I'm 250 pounds. And then they'd say, how tall are you? And I'd say, I think I'm 6'5". Or, you know, we made up all the statistics, and our addresses were all fake. And so what could they do? We had no ID. They didn't have the facility, I don't think, for at least 13 of us. And so they released us with a ticket with our false name, address, height, and weight. Not even a call to show up for court, because they don't know where to reach us.
Yeah.
So by turning us over to the civil authority, was actually easier than the Berkeley experience, because we got out that afternoon after we were asked these questions. And it took probably about a couple hours, but we were out.
Wow.
So the military land issue, the fact that they turned us over, I think, really helped us.
Yeah, it's kind of a victory in a sense, that they didn't know what to do. So
Well, I think there were 2 arrests at Nohili, Barking Sands. The first one was in February, and I think I was part of the second delegation in the summer of that year. And I went to the Google, and I Googled the arrests, and I found out that the military had planned to do 10 missile shots to the Marshall Islands. And this is the irony, is that a Pacific island is shooting into the Marshall Islands, another Pacific island, although it's the U.S. government doing that. And so the fact that the Pacific Islanders the lagoons were being bombarded with these missiles was poisoning their lagoon as well.
Right.
But the fact that we were there, I think, ended the 10 shots, because the GAO, the General Accounting Officer, made a report, and Clinton canceled it after the 3rd shot. We were the 2nd shot. They did 1 shot and they canceled the whole thing. Because anytime you delay a missile shot, it costs millions of dollars, just a delay. And that's what the arrests were meant to do. The activism was meant to delay. And any delay was lots
So it was
of money.
successful.
I like to think that way, I like to think that was successful.
No, you had mentioned you had gotten arrested a 3rd time.
Yes, the 3rd time was just more recently, about 5 years ago. Remember the time when Honolulu was going through 40 days of rain?
Right.
Remember?
Right.
Isn't that 5 years ago? About?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, during that time, Mufi Hanneman, who was the mayor, put up a sign at Ala Moana Park saying that you can no longer sleep in Ala Moana Park, and all of you will be arrested if you continue to sleep in the park. And a friend of mine called me up and said, because we were working with the houseless, and she said, they're going to be evicted. They have no place to go. It's raining. It's constant raining. There's absolutely no place. And so she and her friends who were houseless passed out flyers saying, if you want to there will be a march from Ala Moana Park to City Hall. And I called the pastors and the church people, and I said, come and participate with us. And the response from the church people was, we'll come as observers, but not as participants, which kind of did not feel right to me. I was hoping they'd come as participants, not as observers, but they said, well, their role is to be observers. So we had a march with maybe about 50 people, mostly houseless, with church people as observers. And when we got to City Hall, we linked arms, the ones who were willing to get arrested. And no one was planning to get arrested, by the way. There was no planning, no strategy.
But what precipitated that decision?
Well, I think what precipitated that decision was because when the police came, they had the special forces. They were all, getting ready to march in, and so everybody linked arms. But unfortunately, at one point before they came, someone broke the link. I can't remember for what reason. They went to ask a question. Once the link was broken, the link was broken. And so when the police officers came, they said, move to the sidewalk. And everybody moved to the sidewalk. In other words, they didn't want to get arrested. And so it was raining, and some of the houses were going to pitch tents in front of the city hall, but they were told to remove their tents to the sidewalk. So they were all doing that. And Utu Langi, who I think is quite well known as working with the houseless, he's a Tongan layperson from the First Methodist Church on Beretania. Well, he realized that this was a defeat. So he said, no. He said, I'm going to get arrested. So he marched himself in front of the water fountain and sat down and actually lay down, waiting to get arrested.
Okay.
So some of us looked at him being lonely there, so we said, oh, well, we should join him. So some of us went and sat next to him. And there was one young Micronesian, Chuki's young person, who came and sat next to me. He wanted to get arrested. And there was a Hawaiian lady who wanted to get from Kauai. She wanted to get arrested. She just had a baby in her arms. But before we got arrested, the police talked to the young gentleman, said, you're too young to get arrested, so you better go talk to your dad. And took him away from us. The Kauaian lady called her husband and said, is it okay if I get arrested? And her husband said, no, you have a baby in your arms, so you can't get arrested. So we lost two of our Micronesian people who wanted to get arrested with us to symbolize the solidarity with all the houseless people. And so it ended up with only Utu Langi, myself, and a Samoan woman, and a Caucasian woman.
Just four of you?
Just four of us. Just four of us. So we didn't have people power, and we had no strategy. So this is really the hardest civil obedience for me, because the first two were really pretty easy. But this one, we were actually handcuffed with real handcuffs. And we were told while we were being handcuffed that we were going to be charged with a felony.
Wow.
That this was a felony offense. And the
blocking what? City Hall?
We were just sitting in front of the fountain,
I mean,
and we were all very peaceful.
Right.
We were just trying to make a point.
Right. But when they were saying a felony for what?
Well, their claim was we were on private land. But we were not. Yeah, but they thought that they could get away with saying we were on private land. But obviously someone did not know the laws, including Mufi. I think he didn't really know what he was saying, because he went on TV and said that we were going to really pay the fine and and be put in prison for doing this civil obedience. So he actually went on the radio on TV and said this.
So what was the outcome of the case?
The outcome of our arrest was that two of us, the ACLU went to court for, and because my son had videoed the event, and so all we had to do was hand in the video, and it showed how peaceful we were. And so ACLU, I think, did not have a hard time fighting for us. And the other reason why two people did not get represented, unfortunately, was because that, you know, of the previous warrants, and so it would have meant a separate. And I don't know why the ACLU was not willing to do all four of us together. I would have preferred all four.
Yeah.
But in a sense, the city did apologize. They gave us a monetary redress. And I put in a little paragraph that I have claustrophobia.
Oh.
So they threw in a little bit more for my claustrophobic experience. But like I say, because we had no strategy, we did not have people power. You know, it was more difficult. So if we're to do this again for some justice issue, one should always make sure you have people power, and always be prepared, have a strategy. Yeah.
So do you think, because I know you want to talk about your arrest, do you think it's a good tool to use for social
Definitely.
justice?
And I moved to the mainland, or to the continent, when I graduated from Manoa, and came back to my home in 1995. And I was very surprised to find out that there's so few civil obedience actions in Hawaii. Because where I was from, we had constant civil obedience actions in the Bay Area.
Right.
But when I came to Hawaii, no one had really done very much, and so I was very much surprised that there was so little. And I know that Kyle and Kekuni and others, you know, did civil obedience, and Jun Shimokawa and others did it around the hotel workers. So I think that people are realizing that this is nonviolent action, and like Gandhi taught, and that nonviolent action, sometimes you need it. And I think in the case of the houseless, it really did help, because I noticed that the following day when we stood on the same site and holding signs, there were a lot of cars that came sympathetically honking. And I think that was kind of a turning point, where people felt like if the houseless are willing to stand up for their rights, then, you know, I mean, they're not victims. I mean, there was a lot more sympathy that evolved from the demonstration and the arrests. So I think that's, you know, that's when the shelters were, you know, the churches came in and offered their halls for. So I think the arrest does, it's a jolt. It's a jolt to the community. And I think people do wake up. It gets the attention of the community. And good-hearted people who, you know, most people I think are fair and good-hearted. I mean, they will side with you if you know what you're doing is right and for a good cause.